My ex-wife ordered a paternity test to stop my custody rights, but when the doctor read the results aloud, he didn't hand them to me. He handed them to her lawyer. The conference room went silent. Dr. Andrew Kaufman stood at the head of the table with the manila envelope in his hands, the kind with the red string closure that always appears in legal dramas. My lawyer, Patricia Fleming, sat to my left, with her pen frozen above her yellow notepad. Across from us, my ex-wife Victoria sat beside her lawyer, Richard Donovan, and the smile on her face told me she thought she'd already won. Dr. Kaufman opened the envelope with careful precision, pulled out the document, and read the header aloud to verify the case number and the date. Then he read the conclusion. The test confirms with 99.97% certainty that the tested male is the biological father of the minor child. Victoria's smile evaporated. Her lawyer's expression shifted from confident to confused. And Dr. Kaufman walked around the table and handed the results directly to Richard Donovan, not to me, while maintaining eye contact with Victoria. She'd demanded this test. She'd filed the motion claiming I couldn't possibly be Lily's father because we'd been separated during the time of conception. She'd been so certain, and she was wrong. I'd been fighting for custody of my daughter for 8 months when Victoria dropped the paternity bombshell. We'd divorced 2 years earlier after I discovered her affair with her personal trainer, a walking cliché named Derek, who had more muscles than brain cells and apparently no moral compass. The divorce had been ugly but straightforward until it came to Lily. Victoria wanted full custody. I wanted joint. The judge ordered a custody evaluation and temporary shared parenting while we negotiated. That's when Victoria got creative. She filed a motion in family court claiming she had reason to believe Lily wasn't biologically mine, that I'd been traveling for work during the week of conception 6 years earlier, that she'd discovered old calendar entries proving I was out of state. She demanded a paternity test before any custody arrangement was finalized. Her motion was calculated and cruel. She knew what it would do to me publicly. She knew the whispers it would start. She knew it would make me look like either a fool or a liar. What she didn't know was that I had documentation proving I was home that week. Hotel cancellations, flight changes, email timestamps. But I let her file the motion anyway because my lawyer said something important. She said if Victoria is willing to lie about this, what else is she lying about? The custody battle had started the previous January. I'd filed for divorce in November 2 years before that, 3 days after coming home early from a business trip and finding Victoria and Derek in our bedroom. The image was burned into my brain. I'd stood in the doorway with my suitcase still in hand, and they'd both frozen like teenagers caught sneaking out. Victoria had scrambled for the sheet. Derek had grabbed his clothes and run past me without making eye contact. I'd slept at a hotel that night and called a divorce lawyer the next morning. The proceedings took 9 months. Victoria hired an aggressive attorney who painted me as an absent workaholic who prioritized career over family. I hired Patricia Fleming, a family law specialist with 23 years of experience and a reputation for thorough preparation. Patricia fought every claim. Yes, I traveled for work. I was a regional sales director for a medical supply company, and travel was part of the job. But I was home every weekend. I coached Lily's soccer team. I attended every school event. I was present. Victoria's affair became the central issue. Patricia presented evidence. Hotel receipts in Derek's name. Text messages Victoria had carelessly left on our shared iPad. Testimony from our marriage counselor about Victoria's admission of the affair. The judge granted the divorce and ordered a custody evaluation before making any parenting decisions. The custody evaluator was a psychologist named Dr. Susan Brennan, mid-50s, kind eyes, and the ability to see through manipulation that came from 3 decades of working with high-conflict families. She spent 4 months conducting interviews, observing parent-child interactions, reviewing school records and medical files, and writing her report. I met with her 6 times. Victoria met with her 6 times. Lily met with her alone 4 times. Dr. Brennan visited my apartment twice and Victoria's house twice. She talked to Lily's teachers, her pediatrician, her soccer coach. She was thorough. When her report came out in August, it recommended joint custody with equal parenting time and joint decision-making. Victoria exploded. She filed 3 motions in 1 week trying to discredit Dr. Brennan's evaluation. All 3 were denied. That's when she filed the paternity motion. It was September, and we had a custody hearing scheduled for October. Victoria's new strategy was obvious. If I wasn't Lily's biological father, she could argue I had no legal standing to seek custody at all. Never mind that I'd raised Lily since birth. Never mind that my name was on the birth certificate. Never mind that I'd been her father in every way that mattered for 6 years. Victoria saw a legal loophole and went for it. Patricia called me the day the motion was filed. I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with her name. I stepped into the hallway and answered. She said we needed to talk about Victoria's filing. I asked what she'd filed now. Patricia said a paternity challenge. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remember leaning against the wall and asking if she was serious. Patricia said completely serious, and we needed to discuss how to respond. I went to her office that afternoon. She had the motion printed and highlighted. Victoria claimed she'd reviewed old calendars and discovered I'd been out of state during the week Lily was conceived in late March 6 years ago. She claimed she now had doubts about paternity and requested court-ordered genetic testing before any custody arrangement was finalized. The motion was 6 pages long and filled with dates and implications. Patricia asked if I'd been traveling that week, I said no. She asked if I could prove it. I said yes. I pulled up my email on my phone and showed her the trail. I'd been scheduled to fly to Seattle for a conference March 20th through 24th that year. But Lily had gotten sick with an ear infection March 19th, and Victoria had called me panicking because Lily's fever was high and she didn't know what to do. I'd canceled my flight, rescheduled the hotel, and stayed home to help. I had the cancellation confirmations. I had emails from my boss approving the schedule change. I had the pediatrician's records showing Lily's appointment on March 20th. Patricia smiled and said we'd file a response with all of that documentation. But she also said something that stuck with me. She said Victoria knows you were home. She has to know, because she was there. So why would she claim otherwise unless she's trying to muddy the waters about something else? We filed our response 2 weeks later with every piece of evidence proving I was home during conception. We also agreed to the paternity test. Patricia said refusing would look defensive, and we had nothing to hide. She said let Victoria's lie collapse under the weight of the truth. The court ordered genetic testing through an accredited lab. Both Victoria and I had to submit DNA samples, along with Lily. The appointment was scheduled for October 15th at a medical office downtown. I arrived at 9 in the morning with Patricia. Victoria arrived at 9:15 with Richard Donovan and an attitude that suggested she expected vindication. Lily wasn't present. The court had ordered that a child services worker would collect her sample separately to minimize stress. The lab technician called us back in pairs. Victoria went first with her lawyer. I went second with Patricia. The actual test took 5 minutes. Cheek swab, documentation, chain of custody signatures. The technician said results would take 7 to 10 business days and would be delivered to the court and all attorneys simultaneously. I went back to work and tried not to think about it. Tried not to imagine what it would do to Lily if Victoria's manipulation somehow succeeded. Tried not to calculate how much this was costing in legal fees and emotional damage. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The results came back on October 28th. Patricia called me at 8 in the morning and said we had a meeting at 10. Dr. Kaufman would be presenting the results in person per court order, with both parties and both attorneys present. She said her office had received the sealed results, but she hadn't opened them per protocol. She said the court wanted everyone to hear the findings simultaneously. I asked if she thought Victoria actually believed I wasn't Lily's father, or if this was pure strategy. Patricia said she'd seen parents do terrible things in custody cases, but falsely challenging paternity was particularly cruel because it weaponized the child's identity. She said we'd know the truth in 2 hours. I barely remember the drive to the law office. Patricia's firm occupied the 3rd floor of a building near the courthouse. The conference room had windows overlooking the street and a table that could seat 12. When I arrived, Victoria and Richard were already there, sitting on one side with matching expressions of anticipation. Dr. Kaufman arrived 5 minutes later carrying his medical bag and the envelope. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Dr. Kaufman introduced himself for the record even though we all knew who he was. He verified that all parties were present and that he was authorized to disclose the results. He opened the envelope and read the technical details. The test was performed at an accredited laboratory using standard protocols. DNA samples were collected from the alleged father, the mother, and the minor child on October 15th. Analysis was completed October 26th. Then he read the conclusion. The tested male shares sufficient genetic markers with the minor child to establish paternity with 99.97% certainty. He is the biological father. The room temperature seemed to drop. Victoria's face went white, then red. Richard Donovan's pen clattered onto the table. Patricia remained perfectly still beside me, but I could see the slight upturn at the corner of her mouth. Dr. Kaufman continued speaking. He said the test also analyzed the maternal DNA for comparison purposes, standard procedure in paternity cases. He said the results indicated the tested female is the biological mother of the minor child. Then he paused. He looked directly at Victoria. And he said something that made my brain stop processing. However, the maternal DNA analysis revealed markers consistent with mixed ethnicity not previously disclosed in the medical history provided to this office. Specifically, the mother shows genetic markers indicating East Asian ancestry, which was not noted in her medical file or family history. This discrepancy raises questions about the accuracy of the family medical information provided during the pregnancy and afterwards. Richard Donovan interrupted and asked what that had to do with paternity. Dr. Kaufman said nothing regarding the paternity determination, which was clear and conclusive. However, he was required to note any significant discrepancies found during testing. He said genetic testing often revealed unexpected family history, and in cases involving child custody, accurate medical information was essential. He said the court might want to request updated family medical history from both parents. Then he walked around the table and handed the full report to Richard Donovan instead of to me or Patricia. He said he was providing the report to Mrs. Victoria's attorney first, because the discrepancies in maternal genetic markers fell under her medical privacy, and she should have the opportunity to review and address them before they became part of the official court record. Richard took the papers and immediately started reading. Victoria grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent. He shook his head and kept reading. I looked at Patricia. She was watching them like a hawk watching mice. She whispered to me that this was interesting. Very interesting. The meeting ended without resolution. Dr. Kaufman said his obligation was to report the findings accurately, and he had done so. Patricia requested a copy of the full report. Dr. Kaufman said copies would be filed with the court within 24 hours per the court order. Richard Donovan said he needed to consult with his client before proceeding. Victoria stood abruptly and walked out of the conference room without looking at anyone. Richard followed her, carrying the report. Patricia and I stayed seated. Dr. Kaufman packed his materials and left. The door closed. Patricia turned to me and asked if I knew Victoria had Asian ancestry. I said no. I said Victoria had always claimed to be Irish and German, that her maiden name was O'Connell, that I'd met her parents multiple times, and they were pale and red-haired and very Irish. Patricia asked if I'd ever had reason to doubt that. I said never. Victoria's whole identity was built around being Irish. She wore clatter rings. She celebrated St. Patrick's Day like a national holiday. She'd insisted on Irish baby names when she was pregnant, though we'd eventually compromised on Lily. Patricia tapped her pen against her notepad and said, families kept secrets, and sometimes genetic testing exposed them. She said the question now was why Victoria had lied about her ancestry, and what else she might be lying about. We left the building and stood on the sidewalk outside. The October air was cold and sharp. Patricia said she was going to file a motion requesting updated and accurate medical history from Victoria for Lily's records. She said if Victoria had concealed her actual genetic background, the pediatrician needed to know for proper health care. She said genetic conditions ran in families, and hiding ethnicity could mean hiding relevant medical information. I asked if this would affect the custody case. Patricia said potentially yes, because credibility mattered in family court, and Victoria had just been caught in a significant lie about her identity. She said Victoria had also falsely challenged paternity, which the test had definitively disproven. She said a pattern of deception was emerging. I asked what happened next. Patricia said we wait for Victoria's next move, and we prepare for the custody hearing, which was still scheduled for November 8th. She said the paternity results and the ancestry discrepancy would both be entered into evidence. She said I should document everything and be ready for Victoria to escalate. Victoria's response came 3 days later. Richard Donovan filed an emergency motion requesting a continuance of the custody hearing and sealed records regarding the genetic testing results. The motion claimed the unexpected revelation of previously unknown family medical history required time to investigate and verify, and that public disclosure of such private medical information would violate his client's privacy rights. Patricia called me when she received the filing and said this was desperation. She said Victoria was trying to bury the results. Patricia filed an opposition within hours. She argued that Victoria had initiated the genetic testing by challenging paternity, that the results were directly relevant to the custody case, and that sealing the records would prevent the court from considering Victoria's pattern of dishonesty. She argued that Lily's medical care required accurate family history, and Victoria's attempt to conceal her genetic background was concerning. The judge denied the emergency motion to seal, but granted a 1-week continuance to allow both parties to update medical histories. The new hearing date was November 15th. During that week, I started digging into Victoria's background. I'd never had reason to question her family history before. We'd met 7 years earlier at a corporate networking event. She'd been working in marketing for a tech startup. We'd talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and I'd asked for her number. She'd told me about growing up in Boston, about her Irish parents who'd immigrated in the 80s, about family dinners and Catholic school and summer trips to Ireland. I'd met her parents at our wedding, Michael and Siobhan O'Connell, both red-haired, both pale, both speaking with faint Irish accents. They'd welcomed me into the family with warmth. They'd been thrilled about Lily. They sent birthday cards and Christmas presents. They seemed like exactly who Victoria said they were. But now I wondered. I searched online for Victoria's birth records, but those were sealed without a court order. I searched for her parents and found their address in Boston, their phone number, social media accounts with photos of them and Victoria and Lily at various holidays. Every photo showed the same thing: red hair, pale skin, Irish heritage. Nothing suggested East Asian ancestry. So where had the genetic markers come from? I called my own mother and asked if she remembered anything unusual about Victoria's family. My mother, bless her, had never particularly liked Victoria, but had kept her opinions mostly to herself during the marriage. Now she asked why I was asking. I said the paternity test had revealed something unexpected about Victoria's genetic background. My mother was quiet for a moment, then said she'd always thought Victoria's eyes looked a bit unusual. Not quite Irish. She said she'd assumed Victoria might have some Spanish or Portuguese ancestry that she didn't talk about. I asked if she'd ever mentioned that to me. She said no, because it wasn't her business, and everyone had family secrets. I thanked her and hung up. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I drove to Boston to talk to Victoria's parents. Patricia had advised against direct contact with anyone involved in the case, but Michael and Siobhan weren't parties to the custody dispute. They were Lily's grandparents. They deserved to know what was happening. The drive took 3 hours. I arrived at their house in South Boston at 2 p.m. on a gray November Saturday. The house was a narrow triple-decker with white siding and green shutters, typical of the neighborhood. I rang the bell. Siobhan answered. She looked surprised to see me, then wary. She asked what I wanted. I said I needed to talk to both of them about Victoria and Lily and the custody case. She hesitated, then let me in. Michael was in the living room watching a football game. He stood when he saw me, and his expression was guarded. I sat in the chair they offered and tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I just said it directly. The court ordered a paternity test because Victoria claimed I might not be Lily's father. The test confirmed I am, but it also revealed that Victoria has East Asian genetic markers that don't match the family history she's provided. I said I was confused and concerned because Lily's medical care depended on accurate information, and I wanted to understand the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Siobhan looked at Michael. Michael looked at the floor. Neither spoke for at least 30 seconds. Then Siobhan said they'd always known this day might come. She said they'd promised Victoria they'd never tell, but the secret had eaten at her for years. She said Victoria wasn't biologically theirs. Michael added that they'd adopted her when she was 3 days old through a private agency. The birth mother had been a teenager who wanted a closed adoption. The agency had told them the birth mother was half Irish, half Korean, but wanted the baby raised in an Irish family and didn't want her Asian heritage emphasized. Siobhan said they'd agreed because they'd wanted a baby desperately, and Victoria was perfect. They'd raised her as Irish because that was what the birth mother had requested in the adoption agreement. They'd never told Victoria she was adopted. She didn't know. When I asked how that was possible, Michael said the adoption had been finalized in the 80s when records were easier to seal. They'd moved to Boston from New York right after adopting Victoria. No one in Boston knew them before Victoria. Everyone assumed she was their biological child. She looked enough like Siobhan with the right hair dye. Children don't question what they're told. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Victoria didn't know she was adopted. She didn't know she was half Korean. She'd built her entire identity on a lie her parents had told her from birth. And now a court-ordered paternity test had exposed that lie. I asked if they planned to tell her. Siobhan started crying. She said they didn't know how. She said Victoria would hate them. She said they'd kept the secret for 31 years, and they didn't know how to undo it. Michael said they'd received a call from Victoria 3 days ago, hysterical, demanding to know if there was any Asian heritage in the family they'd never mentioned. He said they'd lied and said no. He said Victoria had screamed at them that the genetic test must be wrong then, that the lab must have mixed up her sample, that she was going to demand a retest. He said they'd let her believe that because they were cowards. I asked if they understood that Victoria's dishonesty was affecting my custody case, that she'd challenged my paternity, that she was trying to manipulate the court. Siobhan said Victoria was desperate and scared. I said she was lying and it was hurting Lily. Michael said they knew, and they were sorry, but they didn't know what to do. I left Boston with more questions than answers. I called Patricia from the car and told her everything. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, we had a problem. If Victoria genuinely didn't know she was adopted, then her lies about her ancestry might not be deliberate deception, but rather repeating what she believed was true. That would make her less culpable in the court's eyes. But it also meant she was living a fundamental lie about her own identity, which raised questions about her mental state and her fitness to make decisions for Lily. Patricia said we needed to approach this carefully. She said we couldn't force Victoria's parents to tell her the truth. She said we could present the genetic evidence and Victoria's reaction to it as part of the pattern of dishonesty. But we had to be prepared for Victoria to claim she'd been victimized by her parents' lie. I asked what she recommended. She said we proceed with the custody hearing as planned, we present all the evidence including the paternity test and Victoria's false challenge, and we let the court decide. She said truth had a way of coming out under oath. The custody hearing on November 15th was scheduled for 9 in the morning. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 with Patricia. Victoria arrived at 8:45 with Richard. We waited in separate hallways until the bailiff called us into the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Whitmore presided, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings in family court. She'd been on the bench for 19 years. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled, with the judge's bench elevated above the rest of us. Patricia and I sat at one table. Victoria and Richard sat at the other. The judge reviewed the case file, which had grown thick over the past 8 months. She noted that Dr. Brennan's custody evaluation recommended joint custody with equal parenting time. She noted that Victoria had filed a motion challenging paternity. She noted that the genetic testing had confirmed my paternity with certainty. Then she asked Richard Donovan to explain his client's basis for the paternity challenge, given that the results had proven it false. Richard stood and said his client had genuine concerns based on her review of calendar records suggesting I was out of state during the conception period. He said those concerns had been resolved by the genetic testing. The judge asked if Victoria understood that false accusations in family court were serious. Richard said his client's concerns were made in good faith. Judge Whitmore looked skeptical. She asked Patricia if she had a response. Patricia stood and said yes, Your Honor. She said the evidence showed that I had documentation proving I was home during the relevant time period, which I had provided to the court before the genetic testing was even ordered. She said Victoria had access to the same calendar and the same information. She said the paternity challenge appeared to be a strategic attempt to delay custody proceedings and cast doubt on my fitness as a parent. She said the challenge had failed and should be considered when evaluating Victoria's credibility. The judge asked if there was anything else relevant to the custody determination. Patricia said yes. She said the genetic testing had revealed a significant discrepancy in Victoria's family medical history that raised concerns about the accuracy of medical information provided for Lily's care. Richard objected immediately. He said his client's medical privacy was protected, and the genetic markers mentioned in the testing report were not relevant to custody. Patricia countered that when a parent provides false or incomplete medical history for a child, it becomes relevant to custody because it affects the child's health care. She said Lily's pediatrician needed accurate family medical information to provide appropriate care. She said Victoria's attempt to conceal or deny her actual genetic background suggested a pattern of dishonesty. The judge asked Victoria to stand and asked her directly whether she had knowingly provided false information about her family medical history. Victoria said no. She said she'd provided the information her parents gave her. She said she'd recently learned there might be some previously unknown ancestry in her family tree, but her parents were investigating. The judge asked what kind of ancestry. Victoria hesitated. Richard whispered something to her. She said possibly some Asian heritage. The judge asked if this information had been provided to Lily's pediatrician. Victoria said not yet. The judge ordered both parties to provide complete and accurate family medical histories to Lily's pediatrician within 2 weeks and to file proof of compliance with the court. The hearing continued for 4 hours. Dr. Brennan was called to testify about her custody evaluation. She explained her methodology, her observations, and her conclusions. She said both parents were capable of meeting Lily's basic needs, but that I demonstrated more consistency and stability. She said Victoria's behavior during the evaluation had been at times cooperative and at times hostile. She said she'd observed Victoria making negative comments about me in front of Lily on 2 occasions during home visits, which was concerning. She said Lily appeared comfortable and happy in both homes, but seemed more relaxed during visits to my apartment. Richard cross-examined Dr. Brennan and tried to suggest her evaluation was biased. Dr. Brennan calmly explained that her conclusions were based on extensive observation and documentation, not bias. She said her professional reputation depended on objective analysis. The judge appeared satisfied with her testimony. Then I was called to testify. Patricia asked me to describe my relationship with Lily. I talked about being present from her birth, about coaching her soccer team, about reading to her every night when she was with me, about homework help and playground visits and cooking meals together. I talked about how the divorce had been difficult, but I'd worked hard to shield Lily from the conflict. I talked about maintaining routines and stability. I talked about loving my daughter more than anything. Richard cross-examined me and asked about my work travel. I explained my schedule. I explained that I traveled 2 or 3 days per week, but was always home by Friday evening. I explained that I'd reduced my territory to minimize travel after the divorce. He asked if I'd ever missed important events for Lily. I said once I'd missed a school play because a flight was delayed, and I'd apologized to Lily and taken her for ice cream the next day to make up for it. He tried to make me sound like an absent father. I stayed calm and answered honestly. The judge asked me about the paternity challenge. I said it had been hurtful and confusing, especially since Victoria knew I'd been home during conception. I said challenging my relationship with Lily felt cruel and unnecessary. The judge nodded. Victoria testified next. Richard asked her to describe her parenting. She talked about being Lily's primary caregiver during the marriage, about sacrificing her career to stay home with Lily for the first 3 years, about knowing Lily's needs and preferences better than anyone. She cried while talking about how the divorce had devastated her, about feeling betrayed when I'd discovered her affair, about making a mistake but still being a good mother. Richard asked about the paternity challenge. She said she'd had genuine concerns based on my travel schedule and some gaps in her memory from 6 years ago. She said the stress of the custody battle had made her question everything. She said she was sorry for any confusion, but she just wanted the truth. The judge asked her about the medical history discrepancy. Victoria said she was still trying to understand it herself, that her parents had told her one thing her whole life, and now there were questions. She said she'd provide updated information to the pediatrician as ordered. Patricia cross-examined her. She asked Victoria if she'd reviewed the calendar records before filing the paternity challenge. Victoria said yes. Patricia asked if she'd seen the documentation I'd provided proving I was home. Victoria said she didn't remember. Patricia showed her the documents. Victoria admitted she'd been provided copies during discovery. Patricia asked why she'd proceeded with the paternity challenge if she had evidence I was home. Victoria said she'd had doubts. Patricia asked what those doubts were based on. Victoria couldn't answer clearly. Patricia asked if the paternity challenge had been strategic rather than genuine. Victoria denied it. Patricia pointed out that Victoria had been certain enough to file a motion accusing me of not being Lily's father, but now claimed it was just confusion and stress. Victoria started crying again. The judge called a recess. When we reconvened, Judge Whitmore said she'd reviewed all the evidence and testimony. She said both parents clearly loved Lily. She said both parents were capable of providing basic care. However, she said the court had to consider credibility and stability when making custody determinations. She said Victoria's false paternity challenge was concerning. She said regardless of whether the challenge was made in good faith or as a strategic maneuver, it demonstrated poor judgment and a willingness to weaponize Lily's parentage in legal proceedings. She said the medical history discrepancy, while possibly explained by Victoria's own lack of knowledge about her background, still represented incomplete information that affected Lily's healthcare. She said Dr. Brennan's evaluation was thorough and credible. She said based on all the evidence, she was ordering joint legal custody with me having primary physical custody. Victoria would have parenting time every other weekend and one evening per week. Both parents would be required to attend co-parenting counseling. Both parents would provide updated medical histories within 14 days. The custody arrangement would be reviewed in 6 months. Victoria sobbed. Richard requested the judge reconsider. The judge said her decision was final and that Victoria could appeal if she chose. Court was adjourned. Patricia and I walked out of the courthouse into the November cold. She said we'd won. I said it didn't feel like winning. She said I had primary custody of my daughter, which was what I'd been fighting for. She said Victoria would appeal, they always did, but the ruling was solid. She said I should focus on Lily and creating stability. I asked about the medical history issue. Patricia said I should take Lily to her pediatrician myself with the genetic testing results and explain the situation. She said the doctor needed to know there was Korean ancestry for proper health screening. I said Victoria would be furious. Patricia said Victoria's feelings weren't my problem. My daughter's health was. I picked Lily up from Victoria's house that evening. It was my scheduled parenting time, and the court order was already in effect. Victoria answered the door with swollen eyes and wouldn't look at me. She called Lily, who came running with her backpack and her stuffed rabbit. Lily hugged me and asked if we could have pancakes for dinner. I said absolutely. Victoria handed me Lily's medication for her seasonal allergies and muttered something about the dosage. I thanked her. She closed the door without saying goodbye to Lily. In the car, Lily asked why Mommy was sad. I said Mommy had a hard day, but she'd be okay. Lily asked if it was because of court. I was surprised she knew about court. I asked what she knew. She said Mommy had been crying a lot and talking on the phone about judges and custody. I said sometimes grown-ups have to go to court to figure out important things, but it wasn't anything for Lily to worry about. She seemed satisfied with that answer and started talking about a project they were doing at school. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat in my apartment and tried to process everything. I'd won primary custody. The judge had seen through Victoria's manipulation. The paternity challenge had backfired spectacularly, but I felt hollow. The victory came at the cost of 8 months of stress, thousands of dollars in legal fees, and the exposure of ugly lies that would affect Lily eventually. Because how long could Victoria hide her adoption from her? How long before Lily asked questions about the genetic testing? How long before someone told her the truth her grandmother had been too afraid to speak? I thought about calling Siobhan and Michael, but I didn't know what I'd say. They'd created this mess decades ago, and now it was spilling into my daughter's life. The medical history issue resolved itself 2 weeks later. I took Lily to her pediatrician, Dr. Raymond Nash, and brought the genetic testing results. Dr. Nash was in his 50s, balding, with a calm demeanor that had helped Lily through numerous ear infections and childhood illnesses. I explained the situation, the custody case, the paternity test, the discovery of previously unknown Korean ancestry in Victoria's background. Dr. Nash reviewed the genetic report carefully. He asked if Victoria knew she had Korean heritage. I explained about the adoption that Victoria didn't know about. Dr. Nash said that complicated things, but genetically it didn't change Lily's needs. He said Korean ancestry meant Lily should be screened for certain conditions that occurred more frequently in East Asian populations. He said he'd update her medical file and order some additional baseline tests. He asked if Victoria would be providing updated family history from her biological family. I said I didn't know. Victoria didn't have contact with her biological parents as far as I knew. Dr. Nash said he'd work with what we had and adjust as more information became available. He said the important thing was, we now knew Lily was 1/4 Korean and could provide appropriate care based on that knowledge. Victoria's appeal was filed in December. Richard Donovan submitted a 20-page brief arguing that Judge Whitmore had erred in her custody determination by giving too much weight to the paternity challenge and insufficient weight to Victoria's role as primary caregiver during Lily's early years. The brief argued that the medical history discrepancy was irrelevant to custody because Victoria herself had been deceived by her parents. Patricia filed a response brief detailing Victoria's pattern of dishonesty and poor judgment. She argued that the trial court's decision was supported by substantial evidence, particularly Dr. Brennan's comprehensive evaluation. The appellate court scheduled oral arguments for February. Meanwhile, the custody arrangement continued. Lily stayed with me during the week and went to Victoria's every other weekend. The transition was rocky at first. Lily cried sometimes when leaving either parent. But after a few weeks, she adjusted. She started bringing homework to my apartment and asking me to help. She joined an after-school art program near my office that I could pick her up from. She made new friends in my neighborhood. Victoria followed the parenting schedule, but communicated with me only through terse text messages about pickups and medical information. In January, something shifted. Victoria's parents called me. Siobhan was crying before she even said hello. She said they'd told Victoria the truth about the adoption. She said Victoria had stopped speaking to them. She said they'd tried to explain that they'd done what they thought was best, that the adoption agency had recommended not telling her, that they'd loved her as their own from the moment they held her. Victoria had screamed at them that they'd stolen her identity. She'd accused them of lying for 30 years. She'd said she didn't know who she was anymore. Siobhan asked if I'd heard from Victoria, if I knew how she was doing. I said no. Victoria and I only communicated about Lily's schedule. Siobhan said they were worried. She said Victoria had always built her identity around being Irish, and finding out she was adopted and half Korean had shattered her sense of self. She said Victoria had started asking about her biological parents, but the adoption had been closed and the records were sealed. Michael got on the phone and said they'd hired a lawyer to try to unseal the adoption records. He said Victoria deserved to know where she came from, even if she hated them for keeping it secret. I didn't know what to say. I thanked them for calling and hung up. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The appellate oral arguments happened on February 20th. I attended with Patricia. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, with 3 judges seated at the bench instead of 1. Richard presented Victoria's case first, arguing that the trial court had abused its discretion. He emphasized Victoria's years as primary caregiver. He downplayed the paternity challenge as a good-faith mistake based on incomplete memory. The judges asked pointed questions. One judge asked why Victoria had proceeded with the paternity challenge after being provided evidence that I was home during conception. Richard said his client had been under extreme stress. Another judge asked whether strategic dishonesty in custody proceedings warranted a change in custody arrangements. Richard said there was no evidence of strategic dishonesty, only confusion. The third judge asked about the medical history issue. Richard said his client had been victimized by her parents' lie and couldn't be held responsible for information she didn't have. Patricia presented our case next. She was methodical and precise. She explained that trial courts have broad discretion in custody cases. She explained that Judge Whitmore had considered all the evidence, including Dr. Brennan's recommendation, testimony from both parents, and Victoria's documented dishonesty. She said the paternity challenge was particularly egregious because it attacked the parent-child relationship at its foundation. She said Victoria's continued refusal to take responsibility for her actions demonstrated ongoing poor judgment. The judges asked fewer questions of Patricia. When the arguments ended, the judges said they'd issue a written decision within 60 days. The decision came on April 3rd. The appellate court affirmed Judge Whitmore's custody order in its entirety. The written opinion was 8 pages long and methodically addressed each of Victoria's arguments. The court found that the trial judge had not abused her discretion. The court found that the paternity challenge was properly considered as evidence of poor judgment, regardless of Victoria's subjective good faith. The court found that Dr. Brennan's evaluation was thorough and credible. The court found that my role as a consistent and stable parent supported the custody arrangement. Victoria's appeal was denied. Patricia called me with the news. She said it was over. Barring extraordinary circumstances, the custody arrangement was permanent. I asked what happened now. She said we lived our lives and focused on raising Lily. She said Victoria could request modification in the future if circumstances changed significantly, but the burden would be on her to prove such changes. I thanked Patricia for everything. She said I'd been a good client and a good father, and Lily was lucky to have me. Victoria requested to meet me in person for the first time since the custody hearing. She sent a text asking if we could talk, just the 2 of us, about Lily and co-parenting. I was suspicious, but agreed. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our homes on a Saturday morning while Lily was at a friend's birthday party. Victoria looked different. Thinner, tired. Her hair was darker, less aggressively red. She'd stopped dyeing it, I realized. She ordered tea and sat across from me in silence for a minute before speaking. She said she owed me an apology. She said the paternity challenge had been wrong. She said she'd been desperate and angry, and she'd lashed out in the worst possible way. She said she'd convinced herself that maybe I wasn't Lily's father because if I wasn't, then the custody battle would be over, and she'd have Lily all to herself. She said she'd known deep down that I was home that week, but she'd pushed the knowledge away because acknowledging it meant admitting she had no legitimate argument against shared custody. She said finding out about her adoption had forced her to confront a lot of truths about herself and her choices. She said she'd been seeing a therapist. She said she was trying to be better. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked if this meant she'd stop fighting me on custody. She said yes. She said she'd accepted that I was a good father, and Lily needed both of us. She said she wanted to try actual co-parenting instead of parallel parenting through angry texts. I asked about her biological parents. She said the adoption records had been unsealed and she'd learned her birth mother's name. She said her birth mother had been a 16-year-old Korean-Irish girl who'd gotten pregnant and chose adoption. She said she'd found her birth mother living in California. They'd spoken on the phone twice. It was complicated. She said she was also trying to rebuild her relationship with Michael and Siobhan because they were still her parents even if they'd lied. She said everything felt unstable and confusing, but she was trying. I said I was glad she was getting help. I said for Lily's sake, I hoped we could co-parent more peacefully. She said she wanted that too. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. I didn't fully trust the change, but it was a start. 3 months later, on a warm July evening, I was at the park with Lily when my phone rang. It was Siobhan. She said she wanted to thank me for something. I asked what for. She said Victoria had come to their house for dinner that week with Lily. It was the first time she'd brought Lily to visit since learning about the adoption. She said Victoria had been civil, even warm. She said Lily had played in the backyard while Victoria and Siobhan talked about the past and the future. She said Victoria had said that I'd been fair during the custody case, that I could have exposed the adoption secret to humiliate her, but I'd let her parents tell her privately. I said I'd never wanted to hurt her, just to protect Lily. Siobhan said she knew, and Victoria knew now, too. She said thank you for being a good man. I said I was just trying to be a good father. She said those were the same thing. Lily ran up to me at that moment, breathless and grinning, asking me to push her on the swings. I said goodbye to Siobhan and followed my daughter to the swing set. I pushed her higher and higher while she laughed and shouted for more. The custody battle was over. The lies were exposed. The truth had hurt everyone involved, but we were healing. Lily knew she was loved by both her parents. That was what mattered. The rest, the paternity test and the courtroom drama and the secrets, would fade into family history. But this moment, my daughter laughing in the golden evening light, this was everything. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.